When it comes to the lore of Skylanders, almost nothing is as important to it as the Arkeyans. The Arkeyans are one of the most influential things in the games, to the point that two of them would have never happened if the Arkeyans never rose to power, and maybe Skylands as a whole. But what makes things even stranger is that not much is known about them in their reign over Skylands. So today I'm going to try and do that exact thing, put together the history of the Arkeyans. But there's a bunch of things I have to go over first. Firstly, this is not a definitive timeline of the Arkeyans. Even though I have a rough understanding of the games, I already know that this theory is going to have a crap ton of holes in it. So if you guys notice anything, I want you to leave it in the comments down below so I can maybe come back to this topic in the future. Secondly, since Skylanders is split into two, possibly three timelines, which I like to call the Academy continuity, the Supercharged continuity, and the Heroes continuity, for convenience sake, I'm going to completely ignore the Academy continuity because it's already non-canon, and the Heroes continuity since some characters have completely different backstories and personalities in it. Thirdly, the most important part of this is that I'm going to be using a lot of theories and speculation. So once again, this is not a definitive version of the Arkeyans' history because I could easily get something wrong about it. And fourthly, I'd like to shout out Ender01 and a couple other people who dropped information in the comment section that made researching this so much easier. So with all of that out the way, let's get into this. When it comes to the Arkeyans, nobody exactly knows where they came from or how they became a faction within Skylands, but what is known about them is that they were the first species in Skylands to discover the tech element and experiment with it, along with the other natural elements of Skylands, mostly magic and undead. But they also have a terrible tendency to forget things that are beneath them, which will surely not bite them in the future, I promise. There's also this weird thing where they drop rocks on a person's head to celebrate their birthday, but it doesn't really matter right now. Due to their knowledge of the tech element, the Arkeyans progressed far faster than the rest of the races of Skylands, and they would become the most powerful civilization in its history. They would create sports such as Roboto Ball and do other things like create robots and the city of Arkus. But they would face a foe that would be crucial to their history and change their society forever. The Darkness. And to understand that, we need to go over how the Darkness came to be. Before Skylands even existed, there was a species known as the Ancients, who basically created everything in Skylands, and they would also be responsible for creating the rift engines that power the supercharger vehicles, which they would use in their own vehicles to travel the universe. But they would also accidentally create a dark rift engine that would, in time, rip open a portal into another dimension, the Dark Dimension. The Darkness is the origin of all evil in Skylands, and it would begin to spread across it like a plague, corrupting every living being it touched and sending Skylands into absolute chaos. As it continued to spread, it threatened to consume Skylands in its entirety. So the Portal Masters of the time, the Ancients, and most importantly, the Arkeyans, would do everything they could to push the Darkness back. And this is where things begin to get screwy. See, in Superchargers, there's these things called the Darkness books that go over the war between the Ancients, their forces, and the Darkness. But there's a lot of contradicting things that happen within these books, such as the Arkeyans not even being mentioned once, even though they fought the same war, and the Skylanders somehow existing in the past, even though Eon explicitly stated that the Giants were the first Skylanders to exist, and that happens after the war. So either two things are happening. Either A, this is a definitive timeline of events that occurred in the past and I'm just wrong, or B, this is a warped narrative of events that occurred in the past. Now, option A is literally impossible because the first Skylanders are deliberately stated to be the Giants and, well, Giants. So the only way this makes sense is if the Skylanders is just a blanket term for protectors of Skylands. But it still doesn't make sense because a modern-day Skylander is somehow in these books, even though this all happened before the fall of the Arkeyans. That happens later in the timeline. And to make things even weirder, nowhere in Splat's history does it mention that she time traveled at all. So the best I could figure out is that this is probably Splat's grandma to the 5th power, but still, it's pretty weird. So clearly option A is an utter bust, so let's take a look at option B, which seems more plausible. But this theory also has a crap ton of holes in it. Now, let's assume that the Skylanders' inclusion were meant to be a stand-in for the uncountable amount of warriors that stood against the Darkness along with the Ancients in their defense of Skylands. But there's one detail that screws up Theory 2's viability in my personal opinion. and that's how the darkness entered Skylands in the first place. In the books, it's heavily implied that the darkness managed to enter Skylands because the spellpunks were responsible for reactivating the Dark Rift engine mentioned earlier, drawing dark magic from it that brought the darkness to power and kicked off the war. But where we find the books are in the spellpunk libraries, and if the spellpunks were the ones completely responsible for the darkness's return, why didn't they try to hide their involvement to some degree? The books paint a pretty damning picture of the spellpunks, so them not lessening the details in their libraries is strange to me. But with that out the way, we'll just go with option B since it makes the most sense. Which leads us to the question of what is true and what is false. What we know is that along with the Portal Masters of Skylands and the Ancients, the Arkeyans, along with the rest of the races and species in Skylands, banded together to lead the charge against it, and that the spellpunks were responsible for the darkness's return to power. But with that out the way, let's get on to the war. This is probably the time when the Arkeyans began to use their technology and intelligence to crank out various types of robots and weapons like mad, which would lead to the creation of, in my speculation, Crypt King's armor and other Arkeyan robots, like Drill Sergeant and Chop Chop. But to be completely honest with you, this all could have happened further down the timeline, which I will elaborate on later. This is also probably the time that the Arkeyans began to turn themselves into robots, due to the fact that the battle suits were used by the Arkeyans, because if the Arkeyans were robots prior to this, then why would they need a suit if they could just upgrade themselves? But before we go on to that, there's something I want to point out that I've noticed. The robots in the Arkeyan Empire are all sentient to a degree. Now, we see this multiple times within the games, but what's interesting about it is that it seems to have a sort of hierarchy-like structure to it, which supports my point that the Arkeyans began transforming themselves into robots to fight off the darkness. Characters like Drill Sergeant and the Arkeyan Conquertron from the first level in Giants seem to have a limited form of sentience, acting more like robots who follow their orders to a T, while characters like Chop Chop, who used to be an Arkeyan elite, and the Arkeyan Weapon Master have a lot more flexibility when it comes to free thinking and will. But besides all of that, another thing would be created this time as well. Petrified Darkness, which would be used to power their armored battle suits, which might be the power source for Crypt King's armor, but I cannot confirm it, along with the Arkeyan robots stationed in the Cloudbreak Islands, like the Rip Rotors and Barrel Bots, and strangely, they seem to be the only Arkeyan robots stationed at the Cloudbreak Islands, along with the Slam Shocks and Knuckle Dusters, which suggests that the Cloudbreak Arkeyans are a faction or guild within the Empire, considering the fact that their aesthetic is far detached from the Arkeyans we see in Giants. They look more like robot conquistadors than the robot knight aesthetic that the rest of the Arkeyans are going for. Nobody knows how long this conflict lasted, or how many lives were lost in the darkness, but we do know how it ended. The Ancients would create an incomplete core of light, which would repel the darkness to the far corners of Skylands once the quote-unquote Skylanders of the time pushed it towards the core. The darkness never fully disappearing from Skylands, but it would be significantly weaker than it was in its prime. To our knowledge, it could only corrupt Portal Masters and goad them into doing its bidding, which is probably why Eon is the only Portal Master left that isn't corrupted like Kaos and his mom. All the other Masters were corrupted and subsequently died because of it, or died out on their own. But it would also get its grasp on the Arkeyans. After the war with the darkness, the Arkeyan society would abruptly begin to fracture in two. The good Arkeyans, who are more interested in things like art, music, and sports, while the evil Arkeyans would begin to crave power and conquest. Now, there's two different theories that I have that may explain what's happening here. The first theory is that the darkness slowly corrupted the Arkeyans over time. We already know that petrified darkness has the ability to corrupt living things exposed to it in a gaseous form or immediately corrupt them through evilization. So maybe petrified darkness slowly leaks out of the crystal, or the Arkeyans who were on the front lines were corrupted over time from exposure alone. But once again, there's a lot of holes in this. Firstly, the Core of Light. If the Arkeyans were truly corrupted by the darkness, then why did they not go after the Core of Light at all during their reign? If they were truly being influenced by the darkness, their main goal would have been to destroy the Core of Light. Yet, there's no evidence that they wanted to destroy it. In fact, it's the contrary. They were protecting it. Along with that, the Machine of Doom was meant to be a trap for people who wanted to destroy the Core of Light. And to cement my point even more, the Machine of Doom is actually shown in a page of the book, and it's just a random Arkeyan war machine down to the patterns on its legs and torso. It was literally copy and pasted from the Arkeyan armory. And the second reason is because the Arkeyans aren't trying to corrupt Skylands. They just seem to be conquering the world for resources and to expand their empire. And once again, if they wanted to corrupt Skylands, they would have to destroy the Core of Light, which they went out of their way not to do, which leads to the question of, what led to the split? And I think I have a good theory on what this was. Fear, paranoia, and a quest for power. Imagine you just got back from fighting a war with an entity so destructive that you and your forces were literally on your heels for most of it, and a literal Hail Mary saved you. And it wasn't even like the force was completely defeated. It was just pushed back to the corners of the realm, so it could come back at literally any time in their minds. And to make matters worse than they already are, the Core of Light isn't that hard to destroy. Kaos's High Dragon shatters it in a matter of seconds. It wouldn't be that outlandish to think that most of the Arkeyans were paranoid out of their skulls about the Core of Light being destroyed, or at least going down. And some factions within the Arkeyans were already craving power beforehand, so probably seeing this as an opportunity and being scared themselves, they used the public's fear to make a grab for power. This may also be the reason why the Arkeyans were so obsessed with conquering everything. As time went on and more attacks on the Core of Light occurred from those either corrupted by the darkness or factions that stood against them, the Arkeyans would become less trustful of the other races, and may have gained the idea that they had to rule over everyone just to protect them because they were too dumb to realize what would happen if the core goes down. Now, peaceful Arkeyans would begin to stand against the Arkeyan Empire, but according to the wiki, most of them would get themselves killed in Roboto Ball. But in my personal opinion, I believe that they were either exiled or killed in secret, Roboto Ball being used as a means to write off their death as an accident and ban the sport after most of them were gone. So as time went on, they became more tyrannical, letting the power get to them, which corrupted their society far more than the darkness ever could. But with the Arkeyans doing their conquesting, let's take a short break and talk about the most important theory that relates to the Arkeyans' history, the Arkeyan human theory. But what I'm about to suggest may be the make or break of this video, and it is that I believe that the Arkeyans are related to the Portal Masters. Now, many people believe that the Arkeyans have always been these magical robots throughout the entirety of their history, but there is one thing that shuts this down completely, and that's the fact that they were the first creatures of Skylands to discover the tech element. Not be a part of the tech element, discover it. This is the only element that is directly stated to be discovered. Yes, it exists along with the rest of the natural elements within Skylands, but the way it's described in the Arkeyan and tech element wiki pages, it seems like tech is an element that wasn't really in effect in Skylands until the Arkeyans were involved with it. If this evidence isn't enough, in one of the story scrolls in Spyro's adventures, the Arkeyans are regarded as sorcerer kings, and in the magic element wiki page, it's stated that the tech and magic elements are at odds with each other, or according to the wiki, so aligned that Magic Skylanders' elemental powers are weakened in the presence of tech Skylanders. This makes it literally impossible for the Arkeyans to start off as robot sorcerers because the elements just don't mix in the slightest until their experiments started, which is backed up by the tech and magic element rosters. Robots are exclusive to the tech element and are nowhere near the magic element. This may explain why Chop Chop even has bones in the first place. They needed a neutral element like undead to keep them separate to stop the tech element from eating the magic element. So this just leads to the question of, what were they? And I have substantial evidence to believe that the Arkeyans are Portal Masters. See, the Core of Light is located in the ruins, and throughout its entire history, it hasn't been moved until Superchargers. There's also the fact that the Arkeyan Weapon Master was just posted on one of the islands, and according to the wiki, he was dormant there for 10,000 years. That sounds strangely familiar, like the Arkeyan Empire falling 10,000 years before the games take place. So this pretty much cements the fact that the Portal Masters and the Arkeyans are obviously linked somehow. They both lived in the same place at one point. But what cements this theory is when Kaos became an Arkeyan robot in Skylanders Giants. The Gauntlet reacted to him, a Portal Master, and turned him into a robot, giving him full control over the Arkeyan's entire empire. And what does the inside of that gauntlet look like exactly? Oh right, a portal. Something only Portal Masters can control. If my theory is true, which most likely it isn't, I just uncovered something fucking massive when it comes to Skylanders lore. That's why the Arkeyans were mentioned in the Darkness books. The Portal Masters may have been one of the sub-factions mentioned earlier in the Arkeyan Empire and just did more. The organic warriors of magic who defended the core of light. But with this little detour out of the way, let's get back to the Arkeyans as a whole. After the Arkeyans conquered Skylands, strict rules would be implemented, anyone who defied them being sent to the mines to work in brutal conditions. So much so that many of their subjects would say that the Arkeyans ruled with an iron fist. And this right here would lead to the creation of the Iron Fist of Arkus. I am not joking or exaggerating. When word of this got back to the Arkeyan leaders, they didn't see it as a metaphor, but thought that the other races actually expected them to have an iron fist. Because they didn't want to disappoint or confuse anyone, they actually went out of their way to make an iron fist that didn't really do anything at the time, just because they wanted to meet their people's expectations. This kind of backs up my theories that the Arkeyans were doing this because they wanted to protect the people of Skylands and not just indoctrinate them into the Empire. But anyways, during the Arkeyan King's public appearances, many of his subjects would ask him what the gauntlet was for, and the current king at the time decided to imbue it with magic and tech, using the gauntlet to control his entire army. And this is where the problems for the Arkeyan Empire starts. Because of the amount of power this glorified glove gave to its user, there would be multiple power struggles throughout the entirety of their history, and this is where their lack of ability to conceive the concept of down comes to bite them. Remember that story scroll from earlier about them being sorcerer kings? Well, it also explains why the city of Arkus is buried underground in the first place. According to the story scroll, a group of leaders were wiped out when the free magicians of Skylands basically buried the city. There is talk about them basically sealing the city away, but that doesn't make any sense since the city of Arkus is accessible by literally everyone, and major events take place in the city. So what most likely happened was an assassination attempt and the Arkeyans undid the spell afterwards. But to be honest with you, this has probably happened before the Arkeyans turned themselves into robots. There's a bakery in the city and the robots are stated not to eat foods. So either society was majorly robots with a couple of cyborgs, or they were just fully robots. But besides that, this is probably why so many Arkeyan locations are buried underground. Someone would eventually get mad and get a group of sorcerers to bury a city, or an armory, or a vault. And since the Arkeyans have that problem with finding stuff beneath their feet, that location would be lost forever if someone didn't have a map to it. But speaking of things being buried, as time went on, a group of heroes known as the Giants would eventually begin to tear down their empire piece by piece, targeting their mining operations before eventually going after the most recent king in the buried city of Arkus, taking on his army of robots before forcefully removing the gauntlet from the king's arm, shutting the robots within the empire down. And this is pretty much where things end, for most Arkeyans. Their empire collapsed. So before we go, let's talk about those who moved on after Arkus. Like mentioned earlier, if my theory about the Arkeyans being portal masters hold any truth to it, that means Eon, along with his niece Aurora, Kaos, and his mom, who according to the wiki is also called Chaosandra, are all most likely descendants of the Arkeyans. I've also suspected that Chill is an Arkeyan as well because Kaos and her look somewhat similar proportion-wise and seem to be the same height, but the thing that makes me question this is the fact that Chill has different eyes and it just seems to be a far-fetched idea. I also thought for a time that Roller Brawl may be an Arkeyan vampire hybrid due to the fact that her and her brothers look extremely different from Batspin and Night Shift, but after seeing this panel in the wiki, I realized that the vampires are far more varied in terms of appearances. But it's still a possibility, but just a extremely slim one. So with that out the way, that's pretty much where the organic Arkeyans come to a close to my knowledge. And with that out the way, let's get on to the non-organic Arkeyans. The major Arkeyans that we do know about are Chop Chop, Drill Sergeant, Bouncer, and the Arkeyan Weapon Master. Crypt King isn't actually an Arkeyan, but rather a spirit trapped inside Arkeyan armor. So sorry buddy, I won't be going over you today. But since this is getting long, I'm going to try and blitz past all of them as quickly as possible. Chop Chop would wander Skylands for centuries before running into Eon and being recruited into the Skylanders by him. Drill Sergeant would be found buried under the ground by fellow Skylander Terrafin, and he would follow him around as a servant due to Arkeyan law, which may have something to do with the Arkeyans' inability to remember things below them. But this didn't sit well with Terrafin, and he ordered him not to follow him at all, an order that he still follows to this day. Bouncer would be brought forward in time by 10,000 years along with the rest of the Giants, and help the Skylanders stop Kaos from reviving the wider Arkeyan Empire using the Fist of Arkus. And finally, the Arkeyan Weapon Master would help the Skylanders repair the Core of Light and would help them navigate the city of Arkus, along with playing Skystones with them. And this is where the tale of the Arkeyans comes to an end. Now, before I go, I just want to thank you all for getting me to this point, and listening to me ramble for this long. It has been a wild ride since April, and I just want to thank you all for tuning into this massive project that I've been working on for a while, almost since the first video. And even if this ends up aging like milk the second I release it, I'm still glad that you all stuck with me until this point. But with that out the way, thank you for watching. Like always, hit the subscribe button if you enjoy content like this, share this around so I can grow the channel, and once again, I will see you all in the next one.